Give me the Bible, star of gladness gleaming, to cheer the wanderer lone and tempest-tossed. No storms can hide that radiance peaceful beaming, since Jesus came to seek and save the lost. Give me the Bible, holy message shining, thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till night shall vanish in eternal day.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Long. I'm with the Western Church of Christ. We're thankful for you being here with us in another Bible study as we continue to look at the book of Joshua. Now, if you have been following along with us, you'll remember last week we talked about Joshua in chapters 1 and 2. And this is picking up on the story where Moses has died and he's been buried. And Joshua rises up as the new leader and the new commander of the people of Israel. And so what we looked at last week is that Joshua is getting the people prepared to cross in to Canaan land, to go over Jordan so that they can conquer. And what he did was he sent in 2 spies to go spy out the land. And those 2 spies met Rahab the prostitute. And last week we talked about how Rahab hid them and she let them down by a red cord, and she let them back up by a red cord, and all that symbolized, and letting go of pain and then lifting back up hope into her life. And we looked at some of that. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go and watch our previous video, the chapters 1 and 2 of Joshua. We get into that. But this week we're going to look at chapters 3 through 5, and this is all about the people of Israel crossing the Jordan River and getting prepared to take the new land. But before we get into it, if you don't mind, if you'd reach down and give us a like, give us a subscribe to our channel, or share it, we'd really appreciate it. It does us a lot of good. I know it can be annoying to hear that, but it does much more good for us than anything else does so far as YouTube is concerned. So let's get right into it in Joshua chapter 3. And we're going to kind of do just a survey of what's going on here, and something that I hope you can see a little bit about God's plan for mankind. And in chapter 3, it says that Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out from Shittim, and they came to the Jordan. He and all the people of Israel lodged there before they passed over. And so what happens here is that they weren't but a few miles away from the Jordan River, but the reason that they left, and the reason that I believe that they left and that God brought them to camp right next to the river, is so that they could look at it. You know, as we read that the Jordan River was in its flood stages. It was flooding over all of its banks, and given the flow of the river at that time made it very unpredictable and very dangerous. The Jordan River itself, the name means the descender, and it descends down, and as it turns and twists, and some of the valleys, it has these mud cliffs that are all around it that are often unstable. It eventually leads down into the Dead Sea. So keep that in your mind, that the Jordan River is this instrument that descends into death in the Dead Sea. And so God brings his people there, and they're standing outside, and they have to look at it for a few days, and they have to stare at it. And you can imagine some of the fear and the anxiety that they're thinking about. They're crossing the Jordan River is something that should be an impossibility without God. And I think that's exactly why God brought his people there in order for them to do that. But in verse 7 it says that God tells Joshua that today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. And he gives them the instructions that the priests are going to carry the Ark of the Covenant, and they are going to go before the people. They're going to walk out in front of the people 2,000 cubits, okay? And so they're going to get out nearly a mile away from the people, the priests by themselves carrying the Ark of the Covenant. And they're going to go before, just as God goes before. He's trying to make the Israelite people understand that they're not doing this of their own power, that crossing that river of their own volition would be impossible, but that God is going to go before them, and that they are going to be able to cross through the power of God. And so the priests follow the instructions of Joshua here, and they get down, and then when we get to verse 14, we have them actually crossing. And it says in verse 15, and as soon as those bearing the ark had come as far as the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the brink of the water, the waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap, very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethon, and those flowing down toward the sea of Arabah, the salt sea, were completely cut off. And so just like God told Joshua, as soon as the priests began to wade out into the water, it says that the waters stood up a far way off, even to the city of Adam, which is about 15 to 20 miles north of there. And it says that they walked out in the middle and the waters were stopped and everything below them ran dry and the waters stood in a heap up above them. And so we get to this miracle that's being performed here. I think it's worth us noting that we were talking about this being an instrument of death, the Jordan meaning the descender that runs down into death or into the Dead Sea. I think it's worth noting that death, if you will, was stopped all the way back to Adam. I think there's a little bit of symbolism being played here, that this death and the crossing through God's power is going to stop death even all the way back to Adam. So what ends up happening is the Israelite people end up crossing. We read about that all the way through the rest of the chapter, and it says that Israel was passing on dry ground all the way until all of the Israelite people get through. And then in chapter 4, it says when all of the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, that God instructs them or reiterates the instructions for them to build a couple of memorials. And so what ends up happening, you see in verses 8, it says, the people of Israel did just as Joshua commanded. They took up 12 stones out of the midst of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, just as the Lord told Joshua. And they carried them over with them to the place where they lodged and laid them down there. And earlier in verses 6 and 7, God told them that you'll do that as a memorial so that when you're walking through with your children and they ask you about them, you can tell them about how God, through God's power, that we cross into the new land. And they set those stones up. But then after that, in verse 9, it says, and Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant had stood, and they are there to this day. For the priests bearing the Ark stood in the middle of the Jordan until everything was finished that the Lord commanded. Joshua to tell the people, according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua. And it ends that verse, the people passed over in haste. Okay, so a few things that I want for us to note is there were 2 memorials that were put down. There was one set of 12 stones that Joshua, through God's commands, commanded the people to pick a man for every tribe, and they picked a rock up out of the river, and they carried it with them. Whenever they finally got through, they got to a place called Gilgal, and when they got to Gilgal, they set up the stones as a memorial to remember the 12 tribes that God brought through the Jordan. But there's that other little monument that gets set up that almost seems strange to you and I, that Joshua goes and he props up 12 stones around where the priest's feet are laying while the priests are still in the middle of the river, and he sets it up as a monument. And the word says that it was still there at the point of this writing, that those 12 stones remained under the Jordan River, even though the people couldn't see them. And so when we look at this, we see 2 memorials being made. And to get back to that symbolism, there's a lot of symbolism that is being played at here in the book of Joshua. One of them being that there is a memorial that is left that the people could visit in Gilgal. As you continue to bring your children, as is supposed to be at least a semi-annual part of their lives as they go by it, that they would teach their children about what happened. This is a reminder that they can constantly do. But then there's that other memorial that's laid within the river that you can't go back and get to again, but you know that it's there. It's at the place where the event happened. I think when we look at and with 21st century eyes, and we can look back and we can look at the commands that God has laid for us, and we can look at the pattern that God laid for our lives, what we can correlate these 2 monuments as is within the river, this one-time event where we cross through water out of death and through death and into life. We look at baptism. That's the picture that's laid for us all throughout the New Testament, that when we are baptized into Christ, we're baptized into his death. We leave a state of death and we come into a state of life as we pass through the waters. And the reason that memorial was left there is because we don't go back and do that several different times. We're not baptized once and then as that baptism wears off, we go back and do it again. No, you're saved from death into life one time in the act of baptism. And so just like that memorial, we can't go back and visit it, but we know what happened. We know that miraculous event happened in our lives where we were washed from sin. And then there's the memorials that are set up at Gilgal, those 12 stones. I would look at those, and there's an event that we do as first century Christians, as God's church. Every week we break bread and we drink of the fruit of the vine to remember what happened in that sacrifice. Just like Jesus died once, and just like we were baptized once, we can't go back and visit, but we remember that when we partake of the Lord's Supper, when we partake of communion. And I think that's so important for us to realize that God has a plan for these things. There are a lot of people nowadays that want to kind of throw off the idea of baptism, that it's just mere symbolism, it's optional, it's something that's actually sometimes idolatrous. No, this was part of God's plan from the beginning, and He has left these types and these images of it all throughout His Word from the beginning of history till now. And so we look at these two memorials, we can relate those in the Christian life to baptism and the Lord's Supper. And remember that we are dying to sin. We have left an old life. Death was on the other side. We crossed through death to become a new person. And that's exactly what happened to the Israelite people, as we see in chapter 5. What happens is, as they get to the other side, in verse 2, it says that the Lord commanded Joshua to circumcise the people. Because, and he gives the history of it, that the people that refused to go and conquer the land when God told them to, those men had been circumcised. But the new generation that was raised in the wilderness was not circumcised, and they were actually coming up on Passover. There's a little note in verse 19 that says they came up on the 10th day of the first month. The reason I think that this is recorded is because that is the day they would have picked out the Passover lamb. And then they're going to take Passover in just a little bit, but they had to be circumcised before they could partake in the Passover. And so Joshua is commanded by God, and he takes flint knives and he circumcises all of the men of Israel that day. And then it says that they wait until they're healed before they go to conquer the land. But this is a hugely symbolic picture that's going on. They had to be circumcised. God is telling His people that you are now my people fully. Okay, He's giving them that physical sign, but He's also telling them that in order to be my people, you have to go beyond just the surface of the flesh. There has to be a cutting away, if you will, not to be too graphic, but there has to be a cutting away that's more than just skin deep, this relationship that we have with God, and we should have that depth in our relationship with God. And then in verse 10, the people keep the Passover in the plains of Jericho, and it says in verse 11, the day after that the manna and the quail cease. God ceases that special, miraculous daily provision of manna that He used to provide for them, and it's because He's completed the promise that was made to Abraham, the promise that was made to Moses. They are now in the promised land. And it says that they ate of the fruit of the land that day and of the produce of the land that day. God has brought them to this point. They were wanderers in the wilderness. They weren't really a people. They had been lost. They were waiting for the people that had rejected God to die. But now they've come from death, through the death of the river, through the water. They've come into a new life. They are circumcised to be identified with God's people. To be God's people, so that they can take the Passover, and they participate in the Passover, and then they eat of the fruit of the land. And what a picture of the Christian story, that we can die in baptism, we can come through, we're a new creation, we have a new identity, we have new fruit that we can partake of, we have new blessings in our life that we can partake in. It's a beautiful picture of the gospel that's left for us in the story of Joshua. And then to wrap up the chapter in chapter 5, to keep in mind, to make sure that we don't read too much in this, that God's story is all about us. In verse 13, it says, when Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, are you for us or for our adversaries? And he said, no, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, what does my Lord say to his servant? And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. And so we have this really unique and interesting portion where Joshua sees this commander of the armies of the Lord, and our minds drift, and we want to know, who is it? And there's a little bit of disagreement on who it is. Is this an angel? Is this an exalted angel? Is this Michael? There's a lot of people that would say this is Christ himself, and certainly an argument could be made for that. He bows down and worships him, and he doesn't tell him to no, don't bow down, stand up, and he tells him to take off his sandals because he's on holy ground. We remember that about Moses with the burning bush when he was in the wilderness, that when God came before him in the presence of the bush, he told him, take off your shoes for you're on holy ground. And so an argument could be made, but I think we would be missing the point if that's what we focused on. What happens here, and what God was trying to tell the people of Israel and show the people of Israel through their crossing, is he sent the Ark of the Covenant out before them. God is the one doing this, and you can follow God through the river. Because if you try to do it on your own, you'll stay in death, you'll die. But through God, when you stay with God, you'll be alive. And the Israelite people did that. Through the power of God, they came through the river. But what happens is, and Joshua gets this idea that everything we do is good. Everything, because now we are God's people. He asked the commander, he says, are you for us or are you against us? And the commander of the Lord's army says, neither. He says, no. I'm not for you. I'm not against you. I am with God. And so there's this tweak that we can make in our minds, is that it's not that God is always for us, but that we should always be for God. What they're going to learn in the conquering of the next two cities of Jericho and Ai is that when they stay with God, they will be conquerors forever, because God is the all-powerful. But the moment that they walk away from God, they're going to find that the failure is certainly what's going to lie before them. And that's what the commander of the army of the Lord is trying to get across, is this reminder that you came through that water not because of who you are, but because of who God is. And you are not going to be an exalted nation because of who you are, but because of who God is and because who you have aligned yourself with. And for you and I, we need to make sure that we're aligning ourselves with God, that we want to do things his way, that we're not trying to conform God to empower us, but that we would, or conform God into a picture that would empower everything that we do, or give us authority for everything that we want to do, but that we would yield ourselves to God, and that in that yielding, God would bless us in whatever we do. I think there's some rich imagery that's here that is just beautiful evidences of God's plan to redeem us through the power of his Son, and he allows us to contact that blood in baptism. I hope you see that here and that you'd consider that. Again, thank you so much for joining us in this study. If you liked what we said, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. We'd really, really appreciate it. If you have any questions about this study that we've entered in now, shoot us a comment down below. We'd love to hear from you. If you have anything to add to it, we'd love to talk to you about some of those things. If you think I'm dead wrong, we'd love to hear about that too. We're so thankful for you joining us. We hope to be able to study God's Word as we continue into the conquering of the next two cities as the Israelite people move on with God. Thank you so much.